What's up, guys? Welcome back for another episode. I got to tell you, I absolutely love doing these. I look forward to them every single week. And this week is going to be an exciting one. I have a ton of information to share with you guys today. We're going to be going through stress and its impact on our health, on our lives, on our kids. And the main place that we're going to be focusing on today is the effect that stress has on kids. We're going to talk about how you can understand this model of stress and its impact, because if you don't understand something, it's very difficult to change it. So we have all of these things in our lives that we want to change, but either we don't believe we have control over it, or we do have control over it and we know that we do, but we don't understand it enough to realize how major of an impact it's having on our bodies. So after today, you're going to have a clear understanding. I'm going to go through some research, but I'm going to make it simple. So you want to hang with me till the end, because I have some really big things to tie everything together as we go through this. Also, if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat. I will be checking on that periodically from time to time here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. So we are seeing kids under more and more stress than we ever have before. And what it's doing is it's been skyrocketing our incidences of sickness, developmental and behavioral issues, mental and emotional issues. And then what happens is we have these sick kids turning into sick adults. So we see in the office a lot of these adults that come in with these chronic issues, and a lot of it can be traced back to things when they were younger that were never resolved, and they just keep building and building and building on each other. But let's talk about specifically kids for a second. We have kids now, their guts are a mess. They're having major digestive issues, allergies, their nerve system is overloaded. They're living every day in this toxicity of artificial light, of artificial food, and a lack of vitamin M. And I bet you guys didn't realize there was a vitamin M. You thought it only went up to K. But there's a vitamin M, which is vitamin movement. We have kids nowadays that are just not moving. And especially now in today's day and age, which I never thought that, it would get to this point. But we have kids that are cooped up inside, sitting in front of devices literally all day long, getting very little movement. And in order for our nerve system to develop properly from the bottom up and inside out and from right to left, kids need movement. They need experiences. They need play. They need connection. And they're not getting that now. I mean, they weren't getting this pre-COVID, but they're definitely not getting it now during what we're having to deal with at this moment in time. And so kids just keep getting sicker and sicker, and medication is not the answer. We really have to get to the root cause of this stuff. When I was a kid, one kid in school had a peanut allergy. There were maybe a couple of kids that were on things like Ritalin and other medications for behavior and focus and concentration. But you were a rare one if you were in that group. Now we're at a point is that if you're not allergic to something, or if you're not on medication for something, that's the rarity. I remember a mentor of mine years ago, he was talking about his daughter, and a lot of people were noticing her, how healthy she was and how well developed she was and how intelligent she was, and she didn't get sick, and she was just very well integrated and great with communication and all this kinds of really cool stuff. And all the parents are like, wow, your daughter is so far ahead of where most kids are. And he's like, my daughter's not ahead. It's just these other kids are behind. And that's a really important distinction that we have to make, is that what we're doing now is we're seeing all these kids, because all of these issues like the 4A's, allergies, asthma, ADHD, and autism are skyrocketing in cases where they're so common that if a kid doesn't have those things, or if they don't have behavioral issues, or they're not on any medication, we look at that as, oh, that's not normal. Like they're usually, some kids have some of these issues. And what we're doing is we're normalizing dysfunction. So if you are in the quote good category, the healthy category, you're the person that's the odd person out. And the people that are sick, oh, that's what the majority of the population is. And so we really have to work on not normalizing these things anymore. The fastest growing population on antidepressants and anti-anxiety are kids. And I see it in my practice where a lot of my patients are just, you see so many more now than 10 years ago when I started practicing are on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication. And so we have to look at where did all this even begin? Because this didn't just come out of nowhere. So where this began is, if you look at, a lot of people think that this began during, like, after giving birth, like then all of these problems started, but usually much later. But actually we have to go back to preconception. So there's this idea of epigenetics, which is above the genes. And so a lot of people think that who we are today, our health, our resiliency, our adaptability is due to our genes. Either we got good genes or bad genes. If we won the gene lottery, then we're going to be super healthy. And if we got bad genes, we're going to be unhealthy. And it couldn't be further from the truth. It's not about the genes, it's about the expression of those genes. So the expression of those genes and what affects that, that's what's known as epigenetics. So when it comes to epigenetics, you have an input from the outside, and then our cell membrane, or actually first thing that has to happen is our nerve system detects a stimulus. The nerve system communicates with the cells, and then the cell membranes interact with the environment. And then based on all of those factors, the gene is either turned on or turned off. And so that's what epigenetics is. And so if you look at a lot of the times nowadays, these parents, dads and moms that are choosing to have kids, a lot of the times they're super unhealthy. So they don't exercise, they don't eat well. They're expressing sickness and disease, even if it's not at a level that's outward. They're either inside at a sub-threshold level. They're not healthy individuals. And then they come together and then they create this baby. Now, the mom, a lot of the times nowadays, super stressed out. They're working all the time, not sleeping well, not eating well. They weren't exercising before getting pregnant. Now that they're pregnant, they're really not exercising. And so a lot of this baby is developing in this environment where already there's tons of stressful inputs being put on the system. And then we go through the delivery process. And if you've ever watched the delivery process, it is not this baby just kind of gliding out of the birth canal and getting swooped up into the doctor's or the parent's arms. If it's vaginal, it's not usually natural. It's usually forceps, vacuum, or at least there's a certain percentage of twisting and pulling on a baby's neck. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to watch that. Or when you do a cesarean section, it's still, you're having to pull the baby out. Usually it's by the head. And so there's a lot of the times those can create insults pre-labor and then during labor. Now this child is born, it's in an unnatural environment. It's not getting the nutrients that it needs. It was stressed out before it was born. And now you have this stressed colicky baby. And then the stressed colicky baby gets put on medications. That turns into a stress sick infant and child. Then as that child doesn't develop properly, we end up with behavioral issues, developmental issues, potentially sensory spectrum, autistic type of a stuck child where they're stuck in that state. Then you get a stuck child after the infant and toddler. Then from there, you have exhausted, angry, anxious, depressed teenagers. And then these exhausted, angry, depressed teenagers turn into burnt out, stressed, anxious adults. And if you are not seeing this, you have blinders on, because it is everywhere around us. And so if we really want to understand how we can have an impact on this, we have to understand stress at a deeper level and our ability to adapt to stress. So you have this thing called the general adaptation syndrome that was developed by a researcher by the name of Hans Selye. He was a doctor many, many years ago. And when he came out with this, he was looking at it based on the what's known as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So you have your hypothalamus, which is a chunk of your brain, sends signals to your pituitary, releases hormones, communicates with the adrenals, which create our stress hormones. And in the general adaptation syndrome, you have 3 levels that you kind of pass through. Number 1, you have the alarm reaction phase. During that phase, that's the fight, or flee, freeze phase. That's where you either freeze because you're so stressed out, you don't know what to do, or you run away from it, or you fight. And so that's the sympathetic response or the stress response that we all experience. Whether you're being chased by a tiger, or you have an unexpected bill or a job loss that shows up on your table, our reaction is the exact same thing in the body. And then we have a change in our physiology. So we produce our stress hormones, increase free fatty acids, increase glucose, increased insulin response. Our body begins to break down. Now, if that's short term, it's no problem. Our body can recover. But the kind of stress that we're under now, and when these kids, for example, are stressed out from preconception and then through the birthing process, they end up in this stuck stress state. Now, instead of it just being alarm reaction, you have this resistance phase, which is the second phase that you go through. And that's where you have this just continual release of these stress hormones, and this nerve system gets stuck in this stressed out state. And then eventually, number 3, you get to the exhaustion phase. And in the exhaustion phase, that's where the body begins to shut down and you get chronic disease, illness, autism in kids, autism, ADHD, behavioral issues. They're stuck. They've reached this level where they can't get past that. And so it's almost like there's a block at that barrier. And so we have to look at where that is. We have to look at where that, what's known as the roadblock injury. So where did they become stuck? Was it during conception? Was it during development? Was it during the labor process? Was it after giving birth? When did this developmental block, this roadblock begin to occur? And then once we can find that, then we can kind of tackle it from there and start to make progress and move the child forward. So what's really interesting, though, about the immune system is this idea of psychoneuroimmunology. This was developed by Robert Ader, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. But basically, he studied the effects of classical conditioning on the immune system. So they took these rats and they gave them this sweetened water with an immunosuppressant in it. And once they were drinking that, their immune system dropped. Then what they did was they removed the immunosuppressant and just left the same water that they were drinking without the immunosuppressant. And guess what happened? The immune system still tanked. And what this showed was that the perception and conditioning was a more powerful predictor of immune regulation than anything else. And so the immune system is fluid and adaptable, and we have control over it. So we can't separate the stress response and its effect on the immune system. It's like trying to talk about pain without talking about the nerve fibers that pain signals travel along. And so stress is absolutely immunosuppressant. And so if we look at the development of a baby, when a baby is born, the biggest thing working in a baby's brain is the brainstem. And so I mentioned earlier how the brain develops from bottom up, inside out, and from right to left. And that's why in the very beginning, when a baby is first born, there is no executive function. They can't make any decisions. They have what are known as primitive reflexes. So what do they know how to do? They know how to sleep, they know how to poop, and they know how to eat. And those are really the 3 things that a baby should be doing. And if they're not doing those things, which we see all the time in the office with kids, is that we have these babies that we're seeing that are not sleeping, they're not pooping, and they're not eating very well. They're not able to latch. They're not able to have that suckling response. They're not sleeping well. And then they're also not going to the bathroom. They're constipated and backed up. And it's no wonder why all of these things are going on, because of that block. So the brainstem starts to work in the beginning, and then as time goes on, you reach these different developmental milestones, and they go from bottom upwards, and they start, as they meet these milestones, these levels close, and then the next one develops and closes, the next one develops and closes, and then you start from the right side and then work to the left side. That's why for a child or for a baby, it's so important that they get stimulated from a physical level. That's why we want them having tummy time, learning to lift up their head. Even things like head control is an incredible predictor of something like autism. They found that kids that were slow to develop in the pull to sit, where by the time they're 6 months of age, when you pull them up from lying down, they should have head control to control their head coming up. If they have this head lag where they're not able to hold their head and it's going back as they get pulled up, that was a big predictor of having autism that might have not shown up yet, that might show up a little bit later. So when we look at the age of a child, we want to look at the chronological age and the biological age. So a child can be 8 years old chronologically, but from a biological functional perspective, they might only be 6 months or a year old, and they're having that slow to progress. So if we look at the development of all these things, there's no wonder why these kids are sicker than they've ever been before, with so much toxicity and so much unnatural things that are not supportive of our proper development. And so if we really want to have a big impact on these kids, what we have to, number one, look at is neuroregulation. And so obviously I have to talk about this as a chiropractor. We have the neuroregulation, the nerve system's reaction and response to the environment is the most powerful thing. When we look at a lot of these issues that these kids are having, it's because their brain is not communicating with the body and adapting the way that it's supposed to, and that manifests as these types of symptoms. So when you have, when we look at this, what we want to look at is how do we regulate the nerve system the best? The biggest thing that we do when we work on regulating the nerve system is we look at the impact of the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is the most powerful nerve when it comes to regulating the parasympathetic side of autonomic function, which is in balance or in opposition with the sympathetic side, which is that fight or flight. So how do we tap into that parasympathetic nerve system more? We do it through very specific chiropractic care, helps to regulate that vagus nerve and that parasympathetic response, because that vagus nerve is responsible for so many things in the body that when it's not working properly, we see the things that we're seeing. So number one, the vagus nerve is a powerful influencer of digestion. It also helps with the neuroimmune anti-inflammatory response. So what the heck does that mean? So the vagus nerve actually regulates and reduces the overall global inflammation in the body, which helps to improve function of the immune system. So the vagus nerve will decrease the stress response while increasing the body's ability to adapt to the environment. It's also really powerful for socio-emotional regulation. So being able to connect with others, look others in the eye, create that emotional bond and that emotional connection that we have kids so much nowadays are not being able to do. And then we also have the smart vagus part of the nerve, which is the situational awareness, perception, processing. So if you think about your own kids that are stressed out, think about it. Their digestion gets screwed up. Their immune system is down. They get sick easier. They're not socializing as well with other people or with friends or with people in the community. And their perception and awareness in their environment starts to go down. And all of this has to do with the vagus nerve and the body's inability to adapt to the environment through an optimized functioning nerve system. So the greatest detoxifying agent is vagal nerve stimulation through upper cervical chiropractic care. And that's where our specific pediatric trained chiropractic adjustments come in, is we really have the biggest impact right at the upper cervical spine and right at that level where it affects that vagus nerve. We want to flip that switch from sympathetic to parasympathetic. So when these kids are subluxated, we have the 4Ds. Number one, we have dyskinesia, which is abnormal movement. Then the next level is we have what's known as disafferentation, which is abnormal sensory input. So these are where these kids have noisy brains. Their brains are, it's like the static is turned on, the volume is ramped up, but you can't make sense of what's going on and you can't hear anything else around you. Then you have dysautonomia, which is a central nerve system imbalance. This is like the gas pedal being mashed down, redlining constantly, and it's just frying these kids' brains. And so you have these noisy brains and these really loud, overworked, influenced brains from this gas being pressed down constantly. And then you have something called dyskinesis, which is an abnormal energy input. So these kids are exhausted all the time, but they're not sleeping very well. And so we really have to do something about this. And so what are some of the takeaways when we look at how to create the biggest impact on this? I'm going to give you guys 7 key takeaways right now. So hopefully you've stayed with me until the end. If you haven't, you're not getting these. Number one is we want to look at limiting toxicity. So everything in our lives comes down to toxicity, eliminating toxicity, and increasing sufficiency. And if we can decrease toxicity and increase sufficiency, we're going to have tremendous improvements in our lives. So limit toxicity. Number 2, more movement. So get your kids playing more. Get them off the devices, whether even if you don't want to be around other people right now, have them crawling on the floor, playing on the ground, climbing, go to the park, go for walks, go hiking, buy some equipment out for the yard for them to be able to play around in and climb in. They need constant movement. Number 3, a better balanced nerve system. We have to create stronger connections between the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere, and from top down, the brain's ability to communicate with the rest of the body. That's where specific chiropractic care comes in. Number 4, social engagement. Get them socializing. If it's not with you and the family, get them socializing with their friends more as much as you possibly can. Kids really need that emotional, social connection. Get them playing more. I talked about that already. Number 6, increasing their experiences. So children learn not through reading or listening, they learn through experiences. They learn through observing you through mirror neurons, and they also learn through getting their hands on things and experiencing things. So if you really want them to learn, it's got to be through experiences. And last thing is, along with that social engagement, you have to be able to create more connection for them. Connection through their nerve system and connection, interpersonal connection. So we have inside connection. They need to connect with themselves more and become more comfortable in their own skin and more accepting of who they are and what they're going through and not comparing themselves to other people. And they have to be able to connect well with the people around them. And that starts with you, the parents. You have to be able to create those stronger connections. And so I know I threw a ton of information at you today, but I hope that this was valuable for you, that you got a lot out of this. If you have any questions about any of the research that I talked today, or I know I went in deep with some of the physiology on certain things. If you guys have any questions at all, don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can comment on this thread. You can send me a private message. You can call us at the office. And I'd be more than happy to have a complimentary free case review for you. We can check your kids personally, or if you just want to ask me some questions about your kids, I'm more than happy to do that for you. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we will see you next week.